that you talked about this and the term white privilege, Matt, when you were in front of, I should say, the Education Select Committee. I'm just showing everybody this in the Times. Don't ask working-class boys to apologise for white privilege, experts warn. What were you talking about?
Well, I actually didn't bring white privilege up in the committee, Joe. I was asked about white privilege by a Labour MP, and I was slightly taken aback because, in a sense, this issue is really not about white privilege. This issue is about the underlying social and economic factors that are holding these kids back. And it's not only that they're at the bottom of the pile, eclipsed only by children from Gypsy, Roma and Irish traveller families, but it's also that they've made much less progress over the last 10 years than other groups in society. So in one sense, I would suggest this is partly a success story for some groups in society. Chinese kids, Black African, Black Caribbean kids have made remarkable progress over the last 10 years. But there is something unique and specific to this group that's holding them back. And my suggestion in reply to the Labour MP was to simply say that our national conversation is changing. The last 6 months has really shown that as we've gone through the protests and so forth. And ideas like toxic masculinity, white privilege are now part of our mainstream discussion, and I hear them regularly on university campus, for example, Joe. But they are, I would suggest, incredibly unhelpful terms when we're thinking through some of these social issues. And if anything, they, I think, compound a sense among this group, not only that they are being left behind relative to others, we can go into that in more detail if you like, but also that they should feel bad about who they are. And the last thing I think these kids really need is another reason to feel bad about who they are.
Sonia?
Well, I don't think we need to worry about white privilege being taught in schools up and down the country, because I just don't think it is at all, actually. I think it is a debate that's sort of going on in universities and other spaces. But I agree there's a real issue around the progress and attainment of white working class boys. There is also amongst other low-income groups. For example, if we look at black boys, they may be doing better than black working class boys may be doing better than white working class boys when it comes to progressing onto university. But we know that young black men suffer some of the worst employment outcomes in the labour market, for example. So it's really important not to seeing this as pitting one group against another. It's really rich, though, I think, to hear Tom talking about the issues for working class kids, poor working class kids, because he's part of a government, a Conservative Party that has failed working class young people and children over the last 10 years. So they're outside of London. Your chances of going to a poorly performing school, not a good or outstanding school, if you're working class or poor, are far, far higher than if you come from a much more privileged background. That is true regardless of your ethnicity outside of London. We've seen Sure Start centres, children's centres cut, slashed, hundreds closed across the country. We see a system in which the government spends much more on young people who go to university than young people who don't, and that has not changed in the last decade. And we're seeing rising child poverty and huge cuts to benefits that have left working class kids, really left out in the cold.
Let me let Tom respond, because we haven't got that long.
I think this is a specific point about why one low-income group is doing much worse than other low-income groups. So I think just to blame austerity, I don't think is an appropriate response. I do think there's a point here about university and the lack of focus on apprenticeships and technical education. And actually, it was the previous Labour government who had this obsession with the 50% target for university places, which I think in some ways may have been quite damaging to these young children that we're talking about, who may not necessarily want to go down that route.
It was your government that got rid of the EMA. It was your government that's trashed further education. So come on, let's not pretend that this is some Labour government. We've had 10 years of absolute disaster in education policy, all about testing, not allowing people to show their practical skills. The Gove reforms of education have helped contribute to this.
One group.
All right,
and they help contribute.
Lloyd, let's go back, because
other ways of learning.
I just want to look at the issue that we are discussing here, which is pitting groups against each other, which is what all the panellists have talked about. Is it helpful to focus too much on different types of identity, be it race, class, gender or sexuality?
Well, I think you have to have an understanding of how different things interact with each other. Is it useful for someone to come along and put you or me or anyone in a box of you are this, so you must be that? that totally obliterates any personal stories that people have gone through, any ideas of intersectionality, of the different things contributing together. So is that helpful to put people in boxes because of it? No. Is it helpful for us to try and explore different ideas in an academic and policy-making framework? Of course. What I would say is I think it's very dangerous to suggest talking about race and white privilege is the same as about talking about toxic masculinity. I think they are different things.
Well, let me put that back to Matthew.
Well, if you don't think that these kids are reading these ideas, then I'd encourage you to go and look at the Amazon bestseller chart of what they're seeing in their Instagram feeds. The idea that school children are not being exposed to these ideas is nonsense. And it's very depressing to see this issue reduced to politics and who did what during government. The blunt reality is everybody failed for these kids, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem. Looking at the statistics over the last few weeks, as I was preparing to give evidence, was one of the most depressing experiences in my professional career. I think everybody needs to actually come together and think about how we can keep good teachers in disadvantaged areas, how we can build up apprenticeships and technical training, and a lot of other things that lots of people have been suggesting for over 10 years.